three sort of main questions that that were asked with relation to Airbnb. So the first one was, what is Airbnb's overall impact on the property market? And we looked at this using a hedonic property model. The next question was, which sort of stemmed from the fact that Airbnb's activity within Sydney is quite varied, and the fact that there's some well-documented housing submarkets in Sydney, is how does Airbnb's effect vary spatially? And we looked at this using a GWR. And then finally, given that pretty much all studies of Airbnb have focused on what happens when Airbnb activity increases, we used the COVID pandemic, which has significantly affected Airbnb activity, to look at the opposite of that, which is what happens when Airbnb activity decreases, to sort of answer this question of, is the Airbnb effect symmetrical? To start off with to just introduce some of the thinking around how Airbnb interplays with the housing market. Firstly, the short-term rentals attract a far higher nightly rent than long-term rentals because they're short-term, and that's sort of the nature of it. And this incentivizes landlords of long-term rentals to convert long-term rentals into Airbnbs in the search of greater revenue. So long-term rentals are converted by landlords to Airbnb. This leads to a reduced supply of rentals in the long-term market, and there's not the opposite of traditional short-term landlords going into the long-term market. So the overall supply of long-term rentals decreases. This reduced supply leads to increased rental prices. And then, given that rental prices are a fundamental variable in explaining housing prices, we see increased property prices. And then there's also that additional demand from homeowners who have got this increased revenue earning capacity from Airbnb. So that's the sort of the background around how Airbnb might affect housing prices. A background on some of the actual studies that have been done into Airbnb. So in Sydney, there have been several studies looking at the impact of Airbnb on the rental market. So there have been studies drawing links between Airbnb activity and decreasing vacancy rates, as well as studies on particular areas and how rental prices increased in places where Airbnb activity has been strong. However, there hasn't been any sort of very detailed modelling approaches taken, and the impact on property prices has thus far not been examined. In terms of studies around the world looking at Airbnb's impact on the property market, there have been several hedonic models which have been able to prove a global positive relationship between Airbnb and property prices. However, interestingly, there's been no consideration of the spatial variation of Airbnb, despite acknowledgement in most of these studies that Airbnb has hotspots and that the activity around cities is varied. So this is something which is missing from those models. And finally, as I mentioned, pretty much all Airbnb models have been asymmetrical. They've looked at increasing Airbnb activity, but the flip side of decreasing Airbnb activity has not been looked at. So we tried to sort of look in some of these gaps in the literature in the Airbnb studies. The data that we were using came from a web scraping company called AirDNA. AirDNA scrapes all publicly available information from Airbnb listings. We have this data for all Australian listings back to 2009, and this contains information on the property price, host, number of days reserved in the last 365 days, as well as the annual revenue, also a rough sort of geolocation of the property and the price per night. From this, we constructed an Airbnb index, which was Airbnb density is equal to the number of, we constructed this on a postcode level. Airbnb density is equal to the total number of active Airbnb listings within that postcode, divided by the area of that postcode in square kilometres. And we filtered for active listings by taking listings that had an annual revenue of greater than 0, which basically implied that they'd had some revenue in the last year. From this measure, we were able to construct this graph, or this visualization of a rough visualization of Airbnb activity within Sydney. So on the left there, we've got all of Sydney, but I've zoomed into inner Sydney there, which is where more of the activity is occurring. So you can see that there are several hotspots in Sydney, particularly around the eastern suburbs towards Bondi, the CBD, as well as the northern beaches around Manly. There's also some isolated patches of Airbnb activity starting to move a bit further west towards the Parramatta River out there. So the first question we wanted to ask is, what is Airbnb's overall impact on the property market? And we did this by using a hedonic model, which was leveraging some of the work that the modelling team in Value Australia project had done. So we basically took the pre-existing hedonic model and then plugged the Airbnb density variable into that, as you can see there. So the study area was the Greater Sydney region. Study period was 2019. We looked at the Airbnb density on the postcode level and also implemented a postcode control. And the temporal scale was monthly updates, so monthly updates to the Airbnb variable and also a monthly control variable. And we took the log of house prices and then the explanatory variable. We also took the log of Airbnb density. The reason for that is the Airbnb density variable was very skewed to the right, so we wanted to induce normality. And so the results were as follows. These are the coefficient estimates for the Airbnb variable, as well as all of the other variables and some model performance statistics there. So the first column just displays the model without the Airbnb variable. The second column displays the model with the Airbnb variable. Since it's a log-to-log scale, you can pretty much interpret that variable as a 1% increase in Airbnb density is associated with an 8.44% increase in property prices. And this is obviously quite a steep effect, and this is without any of the postcode or month fixed effects. So we implemented that in the second model, which is displayed there in the third column, and you can see the Airbnb density coefficient reduces quite significantly to imply a 3.01% increase with a 1% increase in property prices. And then finally, we conducted an instrumental variable specification. This was because of some concerns that have been raised in previous studies about correlation between the Airbnb term and correlation between the Airbnb term and unexplained shocks contained in the error term, things like gentrification. So there's a worry that you might accidentally pick up things like gentrification in your Airbnb variable. So to combat this, we created an instrumental variable, which was basically a combination of Airbnb density at a fixed point in time multiplied by Google Trends of the word Airbnb. And this basically followed the approach of several other studies which have done this. And again, the Airbnb density variable reduced, as we would expect, because we're sort of taking away some of those potential other things that it would have been picking up. And this gives us our final estimate of essentially a 2% increase in property prices associated with a 1% increase in Airbnb density. This figure is pretty well roughly aligned to most of the other studies we've seen. Applying at Sydney's average Airbnb density, you get an average property price increase of about 2.7%. I think a study from Barcelona gave an average of 3.7%, which is probably roughly aligned given that Barcelona's tourist market is more developed. So yeah, this is roughly in the same ballpark as other studies, and this documents a overall positive impact of Airbnb. As I said before, Airbnb's and has been identified by previous studies in Sydney, Airbnb's activity is geographically uneven, and there are also housing submarkets within Sydney. So the assumption that Airbnb will have a sort of global impact is probably not going to hold true. So we implemented a GWR to look at how Airbnb's influence varies spatially. The GWR we conducted using an adaptive bandwidth, and we basically used the pretty much the same input variables as the hedonic model. We just took out the postcode variable because local effects will be captured within the GWR method. So these are the results for the GWR. This is the range of coefficient estimates we got for Airbnb as well as the other variables. So the median value of 0.0127 is in the same ballpark as the final OLS model. It's got a slightly lower sort of middle estimate, but this shows that on an overall scale, Airbnb has a predominantly positive effect on property prices. So this corroborates the hedonic modelling results. However, as you can see, the Q1 estimate is negative. And this shows that for a significant portion of observations, at least 25%, Airbnb has a negative relationship with property prices, which is somewhat surprising. And this is likely caused, well, this could be caused among a number of sort of other interactions by negative externalities associated with Airbnb, such as noise, congestion, safety concerns, and access to amenities. So for a closer look at how these coefficients were distributed, This is a plot of the Airbnb density coefficients throughout Sydney. So on the left, that's whole Sydney. On the right, we've zoomed in. So the purple spots represent clusters of positive coefficients. That's a positive relationship between Airbnb and property prices, and vice versa to the red spots. So probably the most prominent cluster of positive coefficients is out towards Parramatta and in the west in suburbs like Sydney Olympic Park, West Ryde, Lidcombe, those areas. And there's a small but growing Airbnb activity in these areas, most likely related to the emergence of Parramatta as Sydney's second CBD. So things like business motivated travel and probably a growing tourist market in these areas. It must be noted that the Airbnb density in these areas is quite low, so the actual overall impact on property prices will not be as significant as other areas in Sydney. But nonetheless, this shows that in areas, with somewhat lower housing prices and probably less developed tourist markets, Airbnb is perhaps seen as a positive signifier of growth and a growing sort of recognition of the area. And therefore we're seeing these positive estimates of a relationship between Airbnb and property prices. Somewhat more surprisingly, towards the more traditional tourist areas of the CBD and the eastern suburbs, the coefficients are insignificant or negative. So the insignificance coefficients towards the CBD might be explained by the fact that there's significant pre-existing hotel and holiday rentals in these areas. So the entrance of Airbnb may not have had as disruptive effect in these areas as sort of less traditional tourist areas. The negative coefficients around Bondi, on the other hand, are somewhat surprising, given the sort of theoretical framework. And it sort of raises the question of whether perhaps there is some peak level of Airbnb activity after which the oversaturation of the market with tourists is actually seen as a detractor rather than a positive. So some of those negative externalities like noise, congestion, access to amenities that are affected by Airbnb may actually be seen as a negative despite the sort of rental market impacts that we would expect from Airbnb. But it must be noted that upon applying that rationale, we would probably also expect Manly and the northern beaches to also experience negative coefficients. So this is something that we're perhaps going to look at in future work because it's somewhat anomalous, the difference in those two regions. But overall, what the sort of finding is that we've taken from this is that there's not a universally positive impact of Airbnb from these results, and it sort of highlights the need for policymakers and researchers to consider the local tourist and housing markets in their analysis, because the Airbnb effect is varied and depends on the local circumstances. So that was the takeaway from that. The final question we wanted to look at, given that pretty much all Airbnb studies have been looking at increasing, is the opposite, and the COVID-19 pandemic sort of presented quite an organic materialisation of a reduction in Airbnb activity due to the halting of global travel, and there was actually a suspension of Airbnbs between March and May last year. So to look at that, we broke up Airbnb activity for each postcode into deciles. So the higher deciles represent areas with more Airbnb activity, lower deciles less Airbnb activity. And we looked at the impact on the rental market. The reason we were looking at rental prices rather than housing prices is housing prices generally exhibit a lag in responding to supply and demand changes, so they're less responsive. Rental prices, on the other hand, are very responsive to changes in supply and demand, and will therefore display those changes in prices much quicker. So we thought it more appropriate to look at rental prices. This here is firstly showing a look at the number of active Airbnb listings from 2017 to 2020, and we're looking at the Q2. The reason we looked at the second quarter of the year for each year is because, that was the period in 2020 when there was the significant Airbnb reduction, so we wanted to compare that same time period. So you can see here there's an increasing trend for 2017 to 2019, but then that sort of falls off a cliff in 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. We then looked at the impact of a reduction in Airbnb activity on rental supply and rental prices. So these are box plots documenting the change in rental supply and rental prices from Q2 of 2019 to 2020. On the left there, you can see that for areas with low Airbnb activity, so the ones on the left, rental supply fell quite dramatically during the pandemic, and this is presumably due to people sort of moving back into investment properties and taking properties off the market due to general financial distress reasons. On the other hand, in areas with high Airbnb activity, we saw an increase in rental supply, and the sort of hypothesized reason for this is a lot of those long-term rentals that have been taken off the market in the last 10 years, converted to Airbnbs, were now being put back on the market because of the suspension of Airbnb. So people are converting them back to long-term rentals, and therefore you see that increase in rental supply in those Airbnb areas. The impact then on prices is quite evident and sort of follows the general theory of a increase in supply leads to a decrease in prices. So for the low Airbnb activity areas, rental prices remained relatively stable. But for high Airbnb activity areas, rental prices fell in response to that increase in supply, and they fell by as much as 7.1% on average in the most active Airbnb neighbourhoods, which is decile 10. This slide just shows what I was sort of saying visually. So on the left there, a similar graphic to the one I was showing earlier of Airbnb activity in Sydney. So the yellow spots represent the higher Airbnb activity areas close to the east, CBD and northern beaches. On the right side, we've got a graph of rental price percentage changes from 2019 to 2020. And you can see there's quite a strong spatial correlation between areas with high Airbnb activity and rental price reduction. So there's a strong sort of spatial clustering of rental price reductions towards the east and CBD, whereas further out towards the west and south, where there's less Airbnb activity, there's not the same. The rental prices were more stable. So these results in total are kind of proving the symmetricality of the Airbnb effect. So whereas previous studies have shown that an increase in Airbnb activity leads to increasing or a positive impact on the housing market, so too is the opposite true when Airbnb activity reduces. So to summarise, findings of the work have been that Airbnb has an overall positive impact through our hedonic modelling. However, this effect varies spatially and there's not necessarily a universally positive impact, and the actual effect on the housing market needs to be considered relative to local circumstances. And finally, the Airbnb effect is symmetrical. It has both an increasing and decreasing effect on the housing market with increasing or decreasing Airbnb activity. So thanks for listening, guys, and I'll take any questions.
Yep, we'll start questions from online, and then move on to so anyone online have a question? Like, I can go ahead.
Hi, William. I think, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I think your work was amazing. Thanks for the excellent presentation. I want just to share a link to one of the students who worked with me on a spatial temporal analysis of Airbnb in case if it's relevant to your work.
Right, thank you.
No problem. So we looked at the spatial temporal changes of kind of hotspots of Airbnb for 4 cities in different countries. I think it could be of your interest.
Yeah.
Thank
you. Thanks, Sarah. Rich.
Hi, Will. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you.
I was just wondering, because the Airbnb effect seems to also be quite pronounced in a lot of non-Sydney, non-metropolitan locations. Like you can imagine a lot of beach towns and stuff will have a particularly strong effect.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of barriers to rolling out this kind of analysis outside of the Sydney metro area? And do you have any plans to do that?
No, we've got the data for all of Australia, so it definitely would be possible. At the moment, we're sort of wrapping up in a sense, well, I'm doing my master's on a slightly different topic, so sort of wrapping up that that work in a sense, but there's very much the scope to look at it outside of Sydney, and actually, particularly, you know, as COVID has highlighted the sort of expansion of a lot of tourist activity outside of, not internationally, but to regional and regional areas, then it's certainly something that would probably provide a very interesting analysis. It's something we've spoken about, but I guess then time just becomes an issue. But yeah, we've got the capacity to do it for sure.
We will do it. It's just working out if you do it well or
Yeah.
someone else does
Yeah.
it. But looking at, I guess off the back and looking at sea change, tree change, the short-term sea change,
Yeah.
tree change, and using Airbnb as one of the proxies for that.
Yeah. Claire?
It sounds like you've been very thorough and have thought about this very hard, but it seems almost impossible to isolate the Airbnb variable from so many other variables of desirability. Is there anything you think might still be missing, or that you'd want to have data on that you can't get, or?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess the something we thought about is like how much is tourism and Airbnb are obviously inextricably linked, but it's quite hard to separate those two effects, like what is tourism, what is Airbnb, and then obviously Airbnb occurs primarily in desirable regions already. So whether, you know, an Airbnb effect is capturing purely the existence of Airbnb, or also some of the locational attributes of those places where Airbnb is strong, is quite difficult. I mean, I think we tried to isolate it through the use of different control variables, but yes, and sort of with that instrumental variable specification, other things like Airbnb, other things like gentrification, which might be picked up, we're trying to control for. But you've got a good point that it's obviously a very layered variable, and the impacts on the property market will be linked to other things as well. But I think for the moment we were, I guess, relatively happy with the different controls we put in to try to control for it. But it's no doubt that there are other things which are very much linked and may not be possible to control for all of those different links.
So I was interested when you were talking about there maybe being a tipping point as to why some areas are blue and some are pink on your map.
Yeah.
But I was also thinking, because it's the area I work in, it'd be interesting if you could control for whether the Airbnbs are in apartment buildings or not. Because I would think that an apartment building that's known to have Airbnbs in it may actually depress the prices of units for owner occupiers, for example.
Yeah, that's a great point, because particularly, there's a lot of regulation around that's been brought in the last few years around apartment buildings having Airbnb. Unfortunately, I don't think the Airbnb data has an apartment or.
Can we, I mean, that might be something worth teasing out, because if we can separate it like we have with the property modelling, separate it from houses to apartments.
Yeah.
Could you work it out,
might
at least
be.
even on a small sample of the data you've got?
The other problem is we've got a geolocation of the Airbnb, but it's not precise. It's like within 100 metres or so, but you can't geolocate it to the exact property for private.
Are there attribute fields or
of
like descriptions that do you have a description field, that's a textual field that you might be able to ascertain if it's a house or an apartment through a keyword search?
That's actually a good point. I haven't done a good look at
I think we should, that's a really good
it's-
point.
It's
because
not obvious based on the locations, because I mean, you know, there's a lot of apartments around Parramatta, and Parramatta was showing a positive effects still. So it's not obvious at that big scale, but it might be at a more fine-grained scale.
Yeah, on that note, like the GWR thing, one such theory I have is like Airbnb usually competes with rental.
Yeah.
So it's the house owner has to make a decision between like a long-term rental or Airbnb.
Yeah.
And when Airbnb is desirable, like it kind of increases the rental price. Yeah. So rather than rental, so that's how it affects the property market. In areas where the rentals are already really high, Airbnb will not have significant change in the rentals. For example, on that, somebody rents in Bondi, so I can get the similar.
Maybe because I mean, there's the studies that Laura Cromlin and others have done, like conversion of long-term rental to short-term rental, which I mean, yes, those rents might already be high, but you can get even more. Like maybe it's a, $1,500 a week for whatever it is, a 2 or 3 bedroom apartment, but maybe you can rent it out at. Oh, Laura's here.
Hi, Chris.
Hey, Laura, I didn't see you online.
How are you going? Yeah, look, thanks. I was just going to add, just put in the chat, I think you probably can get the description data out of AirDNA, what AirDNA provides. It's how the person who makes the posting describes their property. So some of them are a bit interesting. I remember one person claiming that their house was a castle, which was probably a bit optimistic, but you should probably be able to tease out apartments and houses from that. The other thing that I thought was interesting that might be worth thinking about is certainly when we were doing the research, it seemed like areas like Bondi had reached that real tipping point where the price that you could get for an Airbnb property was declining. And so we were starting to see that flipping back. And so I wonder if that's something that's also going on in the mix, that some newer areas you're still seeing better value from Airbnb, so that's driving everything up, whereas in other places it's starting to wobble, so you're sort of seeing some of that backwards. Some of the price increases and the interest in the market going backwards in those places from sort of 2018, 2019 onwards.
Yeah, that's a great point.
That'd be worth looking at too.
Yeah. I do have time for more questions.
We can go for one. The ones online. Ryan has one. Are there any sources of data research on this phenomenon of conversion from Airbnb long-term?
Yeah, Ryan. Yeah, definitely. So a lot of the so actually, I think Laura, you and Nicole, Garin as well. And there's several Sydney-based studies which were looking at conversion of Airbnb, like looking at the sort of the conversion of Airbnb from long to short-term rentals and looking at rental supply. And certainly there have been hedonic models as well, looking at the impact of using Airbnb as a variable in predicting long-term rental supply. So yeah, there's definitely been several studies in Sydney and abroad that sort of document that phenomenon. And then for Pine, any effect of distance of the community of LGA from a specific area of interest like beach on the price change Airbnb? Well, we didn't study that particularly as an interaction, although we did have distance to beach, distance to sea or city centre in our model. So I guess we would hope that that's controlled for by those variables. Yeah, I think that when we included those variables in there, but we didn't do any specific research on the interaction between those variables.
Yeah, thank you very much. Will, okay. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
That was really interesting and very comprehensive look at Airbnb and Sydney prices. So the next one is like myself and Chris worked on the COVID and real estate market in Australia. So yeah, so to introduce myself, like I'm Bala, so I'm a postdoctoral fellow with CFRC. I'm working on the Value Australia project. I'm with the visualization team working on data analytics and visualization on top of the models and evaluation products which people are building in the project. So this presentation, like basically, like we have done like some work like last year on trying to look at real estate market as a whole, and how COVID has affected it, and like how we can use like city dashboards as a method to kind of view the real estate market. So here I'll give a background of like the literature and like what we wanted to do last year, and then I'll go through briefly through the process of how we built the dashboard and what we got out of it, and what are the insights we got from building that dashboard. So essentially, there are like three aspects of this research. One was like the real estate markets as is. So since Value Australia project was like on real estate market and like on a national level, looking at house property prices, and 2020, like around April, beginning of end of March 2020, we had this question of like, okay, so there has been bushfires, there's been like floods around the time, there have been ongoing pandemic. So what is the impact of these disruptions are having on the real estate market? And then like we kind of had a thing saying, okay, so we've been using city dashboards like to make have a snapshot of other complex stuff. So can we use that for the same real estate market? To give an introduction, real estate market like is not as simple as people usually make out to be. So people tend to look at it as like a simple system of demand supply, but it's much more complex than that. It's very significant in terms of it has like 50% of like household wealth. It kind of like even if you buy a 2.5 pound coffee, like 88 pence is literally going in real estate. It has other industries dependent on it, and it's complex internally. In terms of like what's been sold on real estate market is like very complex. They are all dependent, and the actors are all not like simple buyers and sellers. Like there are like a lot of them, and then they're related each other in a network, heavily network way. And it's also complex externally. This is like RBA's overall macroeconomic model. So that's real estate market sitting in terms of the overall national economy. And anything changes here affects everything else, and anything changes within the market affects everything else as well. And recently, it's been one of the markets which is getting modernizing using. So, for example, WeWork is trying to modernize the office real estate market. Airbnb is trying to work like hotels, and there's PlaceMeter, VTS, which they are trying to do like asset management, investment, and stuff like that. So it's very modernizing market as well. So it's traditional and moving towards like more real time. In terms of disruptions, like we have like. So past 5 years, like we have seen like a lot of series of disruptions coming towards the markets in the whole. So natural disasters, like for example, this shows the bushfire in 2019, and financial disasters since 2008, and EU debt crisis. So they affect the market in like different ends. One is the physical market itself, and then like the investment that goes in it, and recently the public health disasters. Right? So the question was like, so since we are having this like events happening in real time, like, and people want to know what's the impact it has on the market right now, right? So first thing what we wanted to do is like once we started getting those queries, like saying, okay, so what's the impact of COVID in property market? What is it going to be like? What has been? Can we build something to like answer these questions in a timely manner? Like, so that's the first question. And we thought like we have the capability in urban management in terms of urban disaster management. We have like dashboards which kind of like tells you what's happening. So for example, if you take the London dashboard, and if there is a strike announced by the public transport people, you can see in the dashboard how the London is doing on that strike day, right? So we have that capability with using city dashboards. Can we do the same for real estate markets? So that's the question basically we wanted to answer with that. So here, I think we met March in this lab. So we had the team coming in and saying like, okay, we want to answer this. So let's brainstorm how we're going to do that. So the process kind of went like this. Like, so we thought like, okay, let's put all our data, available data in one place and see what we can get out of that. Then we kind of iteratively design some indicators, which from the data we have, saying like, okay, so these are the indicators which we can find, which has some meaning towards the real estate market as a whole in national level. And we implemented a dashboard. So put all the indicators in a digestible way, one page, and we can see everything. And finally, we tried to get some insights out of it. So data collection, we looked into like data sets in 4 major aspects. Spread of COVID, that's the easy part. That we thought is the easy part, right? Because there's so much data coming out in terms of how COVID is spreading, like how many cases, where and all. And then property market, slightly tougher, but like we had the capability to get data out of that. Broader economic context was like even tougher because most of the data sets in broader economic context are like too slow for a real-time dashboard. So for example, RBA does like their economic reports, but they're 6 months, like quarterly or like 6 months. The only thing which we found real time is like market indices, right? So that's like daily. And finally, we had like some sentiment. If you wanted to know the sentiment of it, the market itself. So that we got from like social media, internet search terms. And surprisingly, they were like, not unsurprisingly, they're really easy to get. And surprisingly, they were fairly good indicators of the what's happening in the market. And major problem, in addition to data not being there, is being more valuable. So information on real estate market being valuable. So some of them are not meant to be reused. So even if you get the data, you won't be able to like use them or reuse them like for a dashboard. And finally, we arrived at like a few these indicators. So some of them are national, some of them are state level, city, and some of them are city level, depending on the data set. So for example, I can say mobility index will show how people are moving in cities. So that's like a overall index from Citymapper. And like I can say like clearance rate is like how many auctions, how much percentage of auctions have been like cleared on that week. So that shows like how well, how much demand is there for things. So if the clearance rate is 0, that means nothing is getting sold. So it gives a 1 point reference to how market is performing. In terms of implementation, like, so this is where like I spend most of my time, like last year around April. So it basically like once we have the data sources, then we kind of like implemented a microservices based system where like there are like services which kind of like get the data regularly, harvest them like depending on. So Twitter service is like real time, it just streams the data into the database. The other ones like kind of scrapes the website. So Citymapper is like scraping website. CoreLogic one is like just data source like every daily it runs. And so once it's in the database, then we have like we kind of visualize that in a dashboard, and it's also scalable in terms of like it can go up and down based on usage. So we've spent like a lot of time doing that as well. So it's not one go. So finally, what we got was the COVID-19 dashboard. You must have seen it last year. So we released it like April 22nd last year. And so that's a snapshot of April 29. So if somebody asks like what was happening in April 29th in Australian real estate market, so that will give you like an overall snapshot of that. So for example, we can see like there were like 6,000 cases. This is before the second wave in Victoria. So you can see like the market is responding negatively to the house value index is responding negatively. The Twitter index sentiments were like really negative around the time. Mobility has gone down close to 0. So we can see like how the market was. The clearance rate has been like around less than 50% in most of the city except for Canberra. So this is we got that, and it's still running this dashboard. Let's just see if I can. So yeah, so this is currently how it looks like. It's still negative, but like still there's Twitter sentiment is going up, and you can see like what happened in, after this year, 2021, in terms of house values. It just like went crazy, and you can see mobility has, after dropping back, so it has come back, but it's not still in the pre-pandemic level yet. Clearance rates and housing auctions have gone like pretty much more than back before the COVID things. So it's still working. You can still like go see them, and you can see compared to last year, like things have been like so, but 4 billion in auction sales like last week, which is 10 times more than what this time last year. So you can see that. The dashboard says, so moving on, what are the insights we have from? So first thing you can see from the dashboard, like dashboard like this, is impact of the pandemic immediately on a week by week basis, right? So once you see the dashboard, like first thing you can see is, okay, so we can spot the onset of the pandemic. So once it started, like how the market, so clearance rate kind of went down as market started shutting down, and total auction value went down, and as the cases rise. And we can also see like how Victoria responded specifically to the second wave. So you can see the total auction value going down to 0 and clearance rate going down to 0 as well. But also like later part of last year, like so 2020, summer break, so everything froze. The markets didn't even move anywhere. So overall, like they stayed as they are. And surprisingly, like the median price in terms of auctions didn't even like get affected by it. It has no correlation with like the number of cases at all. So even though the market volume goes down, the price remains stable. It just like there, and even shows like recovery. Like it started showing recovery around like January last year, and now it's median prices are completely off the charts now. In terms of house value, so this one is like a bit complex graph. This is a analysis of house value index by CoreLogic. So what it shows is the state of the market on each day and the increase of the market in each day. So if it is the same amount of money is invested in the stock market, how it will be. So for example, before let's say blue is Melbourne. So before November 2020, the whole year the market behaved as if you're losing money in the stock market. It's like an annualized return of that such a investment in a stock market would be like zero. So if you invest in July, August in Melbourne property market, it was giving you a return of like negative 10% around that time. But like now it's like so you can see that like most of last year it was house value index behaved as a negative investment, and it's kind of started changing back around like January. And it also shows like short-term ones, like for example, the one in Adelaide. So this drop in Adelaide is probably like it was around the time when the outbreak happened in Adelaide for like the 5 days it snap lockdown and all that. So you can see the pandemic slowing down the market, and the daily change in house value was like a lost investment last year. But then the Adelaide market, so you can see like short-term ones, all markets started regulating 2020. This has also been noted in like research in floods in US. So they also like there is also the aspect where like once the market goes down due to like some severe disruption, and the government recovery plans started coming in, the market rally afterwards. So some of the southern states in the US like see the same things as well. In terms of mobility, like you can see Sydney and Melbourne, like how different they were because of the second wave. And the lockdowns don't like once the lockdown ends, like mobility doesn't come back up like as we look. So it still is like around like 50% of like what it was last year. So right now it's if I remember it's I think around 50%, like it was 30% like yeah. Market sentiment. This is like one of the most interesting stuff. Like it gives you like day by hour sentiment of the market, and any event which happens like it can directly reflect in this. So this is like a word analysis of like what's happened. So that's like when November 5th, I think. Like, so when the Adelaide outbreak happened, like you can see like pretty much everybody talking about outbreak around that time. And then like the Pfizer vaccine applies for approval around the time, and then the whole sentiment changes to like positive thing. And on a long term, this actually correlates very well with COVID activity in the things and the market. So this can actually act as a good indicator for how the market is performing, responding to the disaster better than other ones actually. Finally, like challenges and limitations. Challenges are like basically like availability of data. So when we started, like I was new to Australian market as well. So coming from UK, I was very super optimistic about data availability. So I was like, we can have this data. But then when you actually like look at the data and like look at the frequency of the data and the format and what's there, and then you realize like combining all of them, what's left is like not what you actually like looks. So especially COVID data. So there's so much data on COVID and like how it spread and day-to-day data. But when you combine all of them for all of the states, then what we have is like not as robust because there's so much differences. Like Queensland releases data on a hospital district level. Victoria and New South Wales give on a LGA level, and we can't combine them. And the real estate data we have are all on city levels. So when you try to combine, like, okay, so city by city, like if COVID numbers go up, is there any relationship? But then you cannot actually like combine them because auction is for all city level, and we don't know which city boundaries they use. So, and second thing is like the sources are not like cannot be 100% accurate about like how precise and accurate these data sources are. They change, they kind of retroactively change as well. People strike down the case numbers, people change numbers reported all the time. The dashboard mostly focused on buying an option because the rental data we have is not real time. So Airbnb is like a very good source of real time rental data. So how the things respond, but the rental board data sets were like not available for like around 2-3 months. From every 3 months they release the data, so it's like kind of they cannot use it in a real time data. And in terms of the sentiment analysis, like we used a very preliminary sentiment analysis stuff. Like we can do much better. So for example, the ones which we used is just a lexicon based lookup, but it doesn't really do well with sarcasm. Like it tends to like not do well. So whenever like Trump tweets something, it goes like really positive, but because people are being sarcastic about his tweet, so it was like we were looking at it like, why is it like so positive around this time? So but it was all sarcastic. In terms of future directions, like what in terms of opportunities is like, so it's possible to have such a snapshot of it, like a real estate market, so then which will be like a place where we can go and see. So for example, if I want to see how the house value is doing, like that gives us like a snapshot of the market, how it has done for the. So if we can also like expand that into a more central data dashboard for real estate, and it can respond to like other disruptions more like, so if there is a floods this year, so we could have seen like how the floods affected the prices around that area. So rentals and Airbnb are the ones which I want to like include in this. In terms of if we manage to standardize some data sets around rental and Airbnb, then we can actually like quantify the impact in terms of like how much it's impacting the thing. So right now it's more like visual analytics, like there's not really a full number on like how much it is affecting it. And we can always like look into regional towns that's missing in the whole piece. So most of the response we got for the dashboard was that people asking about regional towns, and that's kind of like been positive this year. So regional towns have actually like had a much more positive outcome from the COVID pandemic. So questions? Should we start from online? Anyone here?
I have one. Is it not possible to get information from Domain about rental? In that Domain does list new rentals and it also notes when they're no longer available.
Yes, so that's possible. So we looked into that. It's similar to Airbnb actually. So it's like so it's scraped from Domain, and the capability to scrape them quickly is like, so we need someone like AirDNA essentially. So AirDNA is the link between like research and Airbnb. Like, so if a researcher wants to scrape Airbnb's database by themselves, capability to scrape them is like really it's very hard. If someone or like some project does that for us, like scraping Domain and giving us like a data set which is random, that would be amazing. But that we can build one ourselves, like or if somebody that's actually.
Or we could buy it.
Yeah,
that comes out of the AirDNA is actually quite well. It's low price.
What's the relationship between AirDNA and Airbnb? Surely the website has full of disclaimers about you're allowed to.
They talk to each other.
Scraping cache that
They've got a
information.
relationship.
and also like there is
There's
sort of a
passing off some.
Yeah.
it also comes to that like real estate data is very valuable and people put disclaimers on everything we use. Like even the house value index is like that's the most we can do, and if we're not allowed to like do anything more to the data sets you have, but definitely like we can get data. And Domain and other property monitoring websites have amazing data.
Well, got a question.
I was wondering, so the Twitter sentiment analysis was a really interesting slide you had there. Did you do any, did you look at all of the link between that and the real estate market?
Yes, it has like some, it has very stable relationship. I would say like 0.3 in terms of correlations. So my idea initially was to like do some modeling in terms of like a linear regression model, but then we realized the correlations are very weak. So the strongest you'll have is like 0.3, 0.5, which is, you can say like it does correlate, but it's not much.
Yeah.
But that being said, in terms of if we have a better spatially granular Twitter and COVID data set, that can work. And another thing which I forgot to mention here is like Australia is not, it was not a good case study in terms of COVID number of cases, because we haven't had an outbreak like any other country. If we can do the same thing for US.
But we did have strong lockdowns. So.
Yeah, that's true. So the lockdowns are like, we can see the lockdown and the effect it has on that kind of correlates very well. But if we can do it in terms of COVID number and sentiment in US, maybe like that's county level in US, that will give you like a proper waves of how things move.
I think, and drilling into the sentiment, which I think Sandeepa was doing a lot of that. Who was in the team, then she moved on to work for Commonwealth Bank. Yeah. I guess trying to drill in to get the sentiment around the market. So even just, not COVID being there or not being there, just the whole sentiment of how the market's moving and the pulse of the market and what people are tweeting about, we haven't really delved in.
Was the Twitter sentiment analysis all tweets, or are you able to filter it with?
So I filtered for 200 terms, which are kind of a mixture of real estate and different city names, Australia. So it's a combination of them. So for example, real estate, COVID, real estate, those variations, and then like list of states, major towns, and Australia, Oz.
So you could, if you just wanted to get general sentiment of the market, you could just filter for real estate related terms.
Yeah. If you specifically search for real estate, there is nothing turns up, like very low number of tweets, because
is this all based on the hashtags, or
you need to get terms like auctions and a whole bunch of terms we didn't really.
Right.
But I mean, who knows? I don't know who tweets. I mean, maybe people are at auctions and tweet going, "Well, this went for 200,000."
Just lost at auctions.
Yeah.
But the
500 people.
The key here is Twitter is like so that's another learning, right? So for example, retweets are very powerful. It skews your data like crazy. So for example, if Scott Morrison tweets something, and if it gets popular, that people retweeting that will just push the sentiment in such a way. So I had to remove all the retweets, and then the trends are like very people. It just looks very normalized, right? Mm. So, for example, there was once where like I think somebody tweeted about the vaccine not being safe or something, and then it gathered so much negative, like the whole graph goes.
But that also raises a whole interesting question. Should you get rid of the retweets? So, because like it's noise, but at the same time, it's sort of an indicator of sentiment. If someone's latching onto something that the Prime Minister said, or there's some vaccine thing, then that is a sentiment.
It's not quite the same weight as
proposing
yourself.
Weight it, don't you?
That is like, so what I believe is like, if we can crack that, then it would be it could be, so for example, all the real estate stuff is weekly, right? So, but the Twitter sentiment is like daily. Mm. And we can actually predict based on the sentiment this week, what's going to be the clearance rate next week, next, because we've known like this is what the market has been. And by Saturday, we can say like the clearance rate is going to be like.
There's a whole PhD there if someone wants to do sentiment analysis for the property market, because I guess that was one widget, one dashboard.
Yeah.
One component.
Could be really good.
You have to
it would be
explore at what threshold, what events would be meaningful statistically.
Yeah. So that's
a lot of noise in there.
It's a hard one, but it's easily doable. Like if if you can get, there is, I think like around like 5 to 6 million tweets. I've collected over.
What are the
20 million.
APIs like at the moment? How much information?
It's
do
good.
they
So we
provide?
have, for Value Australia, we have like a license for using that. So I applied for it last year and they gave us one. And I've been collecting it since April last year. So we have almost all the tweets about real estate Australia, those 200 terms, till now, almost on a regular basis, like complete. So I'm using streaming API, so which doesn't even limit your number of tweets you can get. Like, so I'm just dumping it in a huge database. And it's just there. If somebody wants to use it, like, yeah, you have like 5 million tweets to play with.
Scary. Cool, thanks, Bala.
Cool. Yeah, so we're right on time. That's the end of term 1 from us. And so term 2 schedule has, like I'm still finalizing that. So I'll send out like an email on Monday. We can start putting towards speakers for term 2.
So plenty of opportunities for people who want to present.
Yeah. And so if somebody wants to showcase their research, want to have like feedback, yeah, so you can shoot me an email. I already have like 2 speakers lined up for term 2. So Rupa is going to present on term 2 and Karan is also presenting on term 2. So if you want to, like, just send me an email and we can find a suitable space. And so we do have a booking in Roundhouse as well.
Oh, do we?
Yeah,
Okay.
we can go. So, thanks everyone online. See you Monday.
Have a good weekend. You coming to the Roundhouse?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
I have to go up to my office here.
Oh.